Hi, everyone. In this video, I'm going to make the Git repository stored on GitHub, where the programming bootcamp material will be stored. As you work in a programming bootcamp, at some point, you'll also start to use Git and GitHub, just to get a bit of experience with source control in Git. I won't speak in this video about all the aspects of Git and GitHub. There are many. We'll just see how it's done. So first of all, just to differentiate between the two, GitHub is a service. It's a web service. I think it's owned by Microsoft now. I'm not sure. And it is the most popular platform for sharing source files, packages, etc. There are others as well, GitLab and others, but we'll use GitHub. Git, on the other hand, is a command line program, Git, okay, G-I-T, and GitHub uses Git. Okay, so I'm going to log in to my GitHub account. I already have an account. You might not have an account, so create an account on GitHub. Go to GitHub and create your free account. I will sign in. I need to authenticate in this case. So let me do that quickly. Authenticate. So there are all kinds of authentication mechanisms. In my case, I use two-factor authentication and this form. And then I'm going to click New to create a new repo. So at this point, a repo or repository is a place where I store files, source files, and GitHub allows me to manage these files. And if I ever work with other people on the files, they can work on them together. And there are all kinds of workflows, primarily branching, that we can work in parallel. But in this bootcamp, we'll mostly work on a single branch and use GitHub as a way for storing the files. So I'll give the repository a name, and I'll call it Programming Bootcamp V1. Okay, there'll probably be others, and the owner is going to be myself. I'm part of several GitHub organizations, and this is a repo for mostly Python files for the UQSMP programming bootcamp. So that's a brief description, and it's private. I'll add a README file. README files are in a format called Markdown typically, and it's good to have a little README file that describes what's in there. I'll add a git ignore. A .git ignore file is a file that tells you what kind of things not to store on GitHub. So sometimes your computer has files that are temporary and should not be stored, and those can be specified in the .git ignore. And since we're using Python, I already asked GitHub to use a Python template. And I'll choose a license, and I'll make this MIT license, and that means pretty much anybody can do anything they want with it. Okay. Create repo. So at this point, this place, Yoni Nazarathi, that's my GitHub username, and the name of the repo is Programming Bootcamp _V1, exists here, and there are 3 files in the repo. Okay, and here we see the README file. So, well, here we see a presentation of the README file. If I click on README, for example, and hit raw, this is the raw text of the README file. That's in a format called Markdown. So Markdown pretty much looks like text, but you can do all kinds of things like headings by putting this hash sign and other things like that, and then it presents it in a nice manner. You see, this is a title, Programming Bootcamp. Great. So that was phase 1. I have my GitHub repo. It has its own dedicated URL. I can share this with anybody. My repo is public, so I can send this link to anybody in the world. They can see these files and can get them. Now, let's say you get these files from me and you want to download them. So one thing you can do, you can go to code and you can download a zip file of the files. So that's great. It's a file sharing mechanism. But actually, a different thing that you can do is to clone the repository, and this is what I'm going to do now. And in the most basic workflow, you'll have a clone of your repository that sits in GitHub on your local computer. And here I'm going to clone the repository to my computer. So I'm going to be in a folder that I call mine, and I'll do git clone and then paste this repository, what I copied from here, and I'm using SSH authentication. So this is somewhat involved. There'll be a full session for that, hopefully in the bootcamp, where we get this going, and you might need to set some things on your computer to get it going, either SSH authentication or something of that sort. But by running this command git clone, what I got is the objects. See, there are 5 objects, 5 files. Well, you see here 3, but there are just a bit more that were downloaded. And now if I go into Programming Bootcamp and look at the files that I have there, I have an exact replica of these files here. Now I did ls, and that's the Unix, Linux, Mac OS, if you'd like, command for seeing what files in the repo, and I only see license and readme.md, and I don't see this git ignore. But if I'll do ls-a, I'll also see the .git ignore. Okay, so just to see that we can make a change, this is how I'm going to make a change. Well, actually, I will now let's open some editor, and in my case, I'll open VS Code. Okay, but it doesn't have to be VS Code. You can use another editor. I'll go to the README file, and it says this is a repo for mostly Python files for the UPro Programming Bootcamp. I'll put a full stop here. And I'll say files will be added in up until the bootcamp begins. Okay, let's do something like that, and I'll save it. Now, then there are a few Git commands, and one of them is, for example, git status. So git status shows me what file has changed. So this README file has changed. Why has it changed? I just added a few things to it. Let's do git diff to see what has changed. So this looks a bit complicated, but basically it says that we changed this line, which was in red here. This is a programming bootcamp, no full stop, to the line in green. This is a repo for mostly Python file programming, full stop. And we also added this line. So GitHub actually tracks every specific line that you change. And now I'll do a few commands, which will add this file to the repo. We won't go over this just per se now. So it was add, commit, and push. And by doing this, I committed local changes that I have in the local repository. And by pushing, I actually, if I now go back to GitHub and I refresh, we'll see that the file has changed. README has changed, and it says now files will be added up until the bootcamp begins. Now, the nice thing about GitHub is if I now click on here, for example, I can see the history. Okay, so per file, you can see the history, well, for the whole repo, and in this case, it was one specific README file, and I can see the history. Okay, let's just do one more thing. Let's create a new file. We'll make this a Python file, and we'll say print. This is my first Python program. Okay, and that's all this program does. And I'm saving this file, and it's asking me in what name to save it. So I'll save it as first underscore python.py. Python files have a .py extension. Okay, so I have this file. At this point, let's actually run this. Let's do Python first Python first Python, and it ran the program. And the program just printed this. So that's one way you can run a Python program, is you actually have a Python file, and then you use the Python command to run the file. Let's do git status. Now, we see this file in red because it says it's an untracked file. So Git does not know about, well, it knows that this thing exists. Git all the time listens to your folders and sees what's there. It knows that first Python is there, but it's not in the repository. So we'll add it to the repository, and we'll commit it. So, sorry, adding is adding to the staging area, but we'll commit it. First Python program, and that's a comment. So git commit -m is a comment, and we'll push to the remote repo. And let's look at the remote repo. So if I refresh the commit, there's a new commit that's committed now, okay? If I click on this commit, we actually see that this is the difference. So there was nothing before, and now there is this difference. But if we would have changed the file, we would have seen this difference too. For example, if you click on this commit here, then you see the difference of the README file. It was changed from what was in red was changed, and this new thing was changed to green, okay? And our files are updated. So that's it. That's not it. There's a whole lot to GitHub, but the basic workflow that we'll use in the bootcamp is that we work locally on our laptop, on our computer, on our local repo, and we push to a remote repo, and you'll keep seeing your work here. And then one day, if your laptop dies, well, you still have it in the remote repo. If you want to share it with somebody else, they can get it from the remote repo. And very importantly with GitHub, if multiple people are working on the same thing, they can actually share with the remote repo. Look at the remote repo. Okay. That's it for today. Bye.